our distinguished colleague from the United Kingdom, Sir Geoffrey, a British legal professional, professor, expert who served as a prosecutor in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the Slobodan Milosevic case. So, Sir Geoffrey, what are your comments and observations on the issue of personal and functional immunities, in particular in relation to the crime of aggression against Ukraine, and what are the instruments and tools to override them?
Thank you very much. Ambassador Anton, can you hear me?
Yes, quite well.
Thank you for inviting me. And I, of course, much regret not being able this time to be there in Ukraine. You asked me a technical, legal question, and if I don't give you a technical, legal answer, I hope you won't be too disappointed, but I'll do my best. But I must make it absolutely clear that I can't possibly improve on the academic discussion given by Frank Hofmeister and Carrie McDougall, neither of whose presentations I could have given and certainly not improved on. And I know we are going to hear further and interesting contribution about how to deal with immunity from Max Baryshnikov very soon. My conclusion is to some extent affected by the fact that after spending 7 years deep in the law of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and all other international law that related to it, I have since then become rather more involved in other processes, some of which are informal, all of which tell me that which was never really clear at the Yugoslav tribunal, which is that the only people ultimately who matter are the victims. The victims, the bereaved, family members, as well as the state itself. But looking at the personal victims, ask oneself this question: what on earth would they say if a tribunal was established, was in a position or in an apparent position to deal with Putin and the other two, or any leading members of the army, or any subordinates carrying out wicked crimes, and they were to hear that there was an argument about immunity, why they should not be tried? They would regard the world order as of little value. Imagine yourself also being a trial judge or a composition of judges, where the only reason why Putin would not be tried is a detailed and academic argument on immunity. The judges would know they would be condemned, and rightly so. It seems to me, and I've said this before, but it's worth repeating, that Ukraine, having established itself on the highest moral ground, or indeed on moral peaks, is ultimately entitled to full international support for whichever kind of accountability process it decides upon. And it is quite clear to me at the moment that the chosen mechanism is an international tribunal, and therefore support must be given for that. And the arguments against immunity appear to me to be very powerful. But, and it's an important but, we have to look not just to the present, but to the future. And a number of considerations arise when we do, bearing in mind that the 100 100,000 cases, constituting the 99.9% of cases to be dealt with in Ukraine, will take decades to investigate and to try. I'll come back to the 0.1% of cases in a minute, but we need to have in mind as we look forward with ideas and concepts and problems of immunity on one side and realities on the other, that within those decades of investigations and trials, people will inevitably demand, whether we like it or not, and whether Ukraine likes it or not, that other methods of disposal may be appropriate in the interests of Ukraine as well as in the interests of the world as a whole. Dealing with the 0.1% of cases that Anton envisages not being tried within Ukraine, why not? I repeat again what I have argued from the beginning, that all accountability mechanisms concerning this war should be dealt with by Ukrainians, in Ukraine if at all possible, and in the Ukrainian and Russian languages, because trying anything in a foreign language diminishes the prospect of getting it absolutely right. And ask yourself the question whether the United States and Canada were to find themselves at war, or if England was to find itself at war with independent Scotland, would any of those four nations allow for the intervention of internationals in the adjudication process or accountability processes that would follow? Of course they wouldn't. Nor would they allow them to be managed in any other language but their own. And one has to be very, very careful about the hegemonic effect of the use of the English language. So these are some of the more general considerations about whether the preferred option of an international tribunal, which I am more than happy to support if that is what Ukraine wants, is actually completely the right answer. Now, I don't for 1 minute propose any of the informal mechanisms that I've been involved with, and I recognize that informal mechanisms of one kind or another, whether people's tribunals or truth commissions, are rarely, if ever, translatable into another environment. When we are looking at the question of immunity, we are looking at the question of immunity from process, not at the question of immunity from truth. It was very interesting for me to hear Anton refer to the need for the citizens of Russia to be held accountable by one method or another. And I think we're going to hear this afternoon of the value of the Nuremberg trial, which of course is of immense value because it was a trial of the leadership that happened very quickly and that endorsed absolutely the question of where moral right and moral wrong fell, determined by total defeat of Nazi Germany. But did that trial and the associated trials, did they have the effect that we would now require of them? No, they didn't. Because if you examine, on two grounds, because if you examine the attitude of those in Nazi Germany from the very top, close to Hitler, down to the bystanders at Kristallnacht, from the moment of the end of the war and until the end of all those people's lives, the vast majority were never prepared to acknowledge their real responsibility for what happened. And why is that important? The other reason Nuremberg's failings need to be confronted is this: after Nuremberg, was there deterrence? Vietnam happened. Many other wars happened. Do we know if any wars were defeated or rather stopped as a result of the Nuremberg trials? Hard to know. There's no evidence that deterrence worked. And so, as we consider Ukraine's choice, and it seems to me a very good choice, but I just don't know if it's the best, of an international tribunal. First, I would support it more wholeheartedly if it was run by Ukrainians for themselves, as in my view, it definitely should be. And if it were considered within an overall view that Ukraine has an opportunity to lead on, to look at what comes next. And here, Ukraine's interests and the interests of the rest of us do not necessarily absolutely coincide. Ukraine's interests, which will be delivered by an effective international tribunal, include retribution for the victims, and that's immensely important. And any of us who have not been victims cannot know how important. It's also to achieve financial recovery of money that may help in the rebuilding of Ukraine. Those are their interests, your interests, Ambassador. Our interests, now that nuclear war is the subject of recurring threat and reference, is to deter others as mad as Putin, who need to be stopped in what they're doing. And I come back to the ambassador's observation about the people of Russia and my observations about how Nuremberg did not succeed in changing the minds of the people of the country concerned. How can whatever Ukraine does now by accountability reveal in Russians themselves the recognition that they have been supporters of that which is criminal and evil? And how can we do something now in the accountability mechanisms that may be chosen by Ukraine to ensure that the next similarly disposed dictator, recognizing that he may not be able to take his people with him if and when he is called to account, may decide actually that it's too dangerous even to launch the exercise he has in mind. And then one last point about an international or internationalized, and here it doesn't matter, tribunal, before I close. If any and every tribunal or process that has international power within it will yield to the interests of the other major countries if and whenever they do not coincide with the interests of Ukraine. Do not be so foolish as to think that an international tribunal's overseas members will have the justice interests of Ukraine in mind if they do not coincide with theirs. The Yugoslav tribunal, arguably the very best evidence about Srebrenica, had an investigation that was simply stopped by the power of a major country because that country and possibly one or two others associated with it were concerned about reputational damage to them. And the truth of that has never emerged. And the same will happen if you ever allow internationals to have control over your justice process. So, in conclusion, if it is Ukraine's considered choice to have an international tribunal, we must support it, although I hope it will be comprised of Ukrainians taking international advice and support, but no more. When it comes to any question of immunity, I don't think anybody need be concerned in a war of this magnitude and wickedness that judges dealing with the issue will find against immunity as a defense to what has been done against your people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey, for your valuable remarks.